Charlie X is one of those episodes you don't forget very quickly, partly because it's so close to the beginning of the series. It's episode two, so the second Star Trek ever to be aired, but also because it's just so weird. And for me, there's also an extra layer of interest now as I rewatch it as an adult. And the topic of social awkwardness stands out to me a lot, which is pretty central to the character of Charlie. And since that's something that I've had to spend a lot of time and energy myself thinking about and working through in my own life, it makes that aspect much more interesting to me. And because I can relate with Charlie in certain ways, I guess I find the portrayals of Charlie's awkwardness not only intriguing, also sometimes a little bit uncomfortable to watch. And the end of the episode is so discouraging too, because even though the final scenes are very engaging and very well put together, fun to watch in a way, but it's so sad how Charlie basically gets sent away forever at the very end. But we'll get to that. But anyway, I think what makes this episode stand out the most for me is that it's really the first true social awkwardness story in Star Trek. I think the struggle of the socially awkward person really is a consistent theme throughout all of Star Trek. And I think it's a safe bet to say that real life people who struggle with social awkwardness have often related with Star Trek, partly because there are so many stories that include that element. And almost every Star Trek series has at least one important character whose roles and identity are heavily shaped by some kind of social awkwardness as part of their character identity. And in a way, I guess that story trend kind of started right here in Charlie X, because even though we did have the emotionless Spock last episode in the Man Trap, episode one, social awkwardness wasn't really an expressed struggle for him. The struggle of the socially awkward person really got its first bit of limelight in this second ever episode to be aired, Charlie X, and that theme would then stretch throughout all Star Trek on up to the present day. Let's do a quick survey of the major portrayals of social awkwardness throughout all the various stages of Star Trek. Now, if you want to skip this part and jump to where I actually start discussing Charlie X, feel free to do that. I got chapter markers in the description. I just think it's a lot of fun sometimes to pause for a minute and just survey a theme that goes throughout all of Star Trek. So the earliest example you might think would probably be the TOS of Vulcans. Vulcans are really, in a way, socially awkward, but it's not usually something that's seen as a real disadvantage. Vulcans don't tend to have serious issues resulting from their social awkwardness, but they definitely do have culturally related differences that make them socially different from those around them. And Spock sometimes fails to follow certain rules of etiquette, for example, but sometimes that's voluntary, and it doesn't seem to be a source of distress at all for Spock, and it doesn't seem to form a handicap as much as it does just kind of an annoyance for other people. And part of that's because Spock is just so generally successful in everything he does. And because he sometimes is also skilled at reading people, which is a part of usually what the deficit is for social awkwardness. But a lot of the time he seems like he can read people. But the times that this does become a really serious problem, certain situations, it seems like around leadership. And the one episode that comes to mind is the episode Galileo 7, where that shuttle crashes on the planet and Spock is in charge of the away team. And he really doesn't have the skills to lead them without what ends up happening is they end up resenting him and challenging his leadership basically the whole time. Um, so the Vulcans, and then we get Charlie as a one-off character here in episode two, who's more of the ordinary kind of socially awkward. And we'll get more into detail on that in the rest of the video. But moving on through the series, in the next generation, we have Data, who fits the social awkwardness stereotype in a much more disadvantaging kind of way than it does Spock. It's kind of like Data's the version of Spock who actually knows that something is missing and he's really struggling to fill that. And he tends to do things that are socially wrong in a more egregious way than Spock does. And I think tends to be more oblivious about those things than Spock. I think a lot of people on the autistic spectrum relate with both Data and Spock, and I think it'd probably be fair to say that Spock is more who they want to be and who they wish everybody would be, whereas Data is more someone they can, yes, they admire Data, but also relate to his struggles, his sense of discontent, his sense of handicap that Data experiences. Also in the next generation, Barclay. Barclay's kind of a human version of social awkwardness. He doesn't have superpowers like Spock or Data does. He's really just the bumbling, stammering, socially awkward guy with also a bunch of other neuroses to go along with that. Barclay's also an important model to have in our mix here because his social awkwardness is mixed with a significant percentage of also social anxiety. And in real life, there's often an overlap to some degree between those two. If you've got poor social experiences, you may tend to be nervous around social situations. And if you're nervous and socially anxious, then you may avoid social situations. You may fail to develop social skills. So that's why there's kind of an overlap a lot of the time, but there doesn't have to be. I think most socially awkward Star Trek characters don't seem to really be experiencing noticeable social anxiety. So because of that, Barclay fills a unique role by having a strong mix of both of those, both the social awkwardness and the social anxiety. Moving on to DS9, Odo is socially awkward, but partly by choice. He's not like Spock, who's stiffly holding to his foreign ideals, nor is he more like Data, where he's just intrinsically limited. But instead, it seems like Odo's social awkwardness results from a lifestyle of remaining aloof, of kind of being angry at and resistant to many of the relational aspects of life, and of really just preferring to keep away from relationships or connection. And of course, this also relates to his being a non-solid being and feeling like he doesn't belong. Sometimes it seems that even when Odo isn't comfortable enough to take part in ordinary social interactions, he may have varying levels of perception. From a distance as an observer, he may kind of understand what's going on, unlike your typical socially awkward person. Another aspect that makes Odo intriguing for this discussion is that, in a way, the concept of being a shapeshifter is something that a lot of socially awkward people may relate to in kind of an indirect way because Odo finds himself as a changeling trying to become something that isn't native to him. He takes the shape of something, for example. And if you remember that one time, the female shapeshifter was trying to coach him to be a better changeling. And she told him, this was in one of the later seasons, she says he needs to, turn into a rock and he needs to stay there and be with it until he actually gets a sense of what it means to be, like to really be a rock, to be a natural, like an actual rock, or if it's a bird, whatever. And Odo's kind of baffled by that. He's kind of like, I don't have a clue. He tells Kira later, I was the rock, I was the tree, I was the whatever. And no matter how much I do it, I don't have a clue what she's saying. I don't have a clue what it would be to actually be this thing that I'm not. Well, moving on to Voyager. The doctor is very socially awkward and often in an abrasive kind of way. He's kind of like the crude savant who's always looking down on other people. And that's because that's how Dr. Zimmerman was, who designed the EMH. And the EMH Mark I just wasn't designed to have any particular bedside manner. It wasn't given any special personality subroutine. So it basically just got Dr. Zimmerman's personality was just kind of dumped in there. And I think that the Doctor in Voyager is one of the least likable of the various examples of social awkwardness throughout Star Trek, because his rudeness and his kind of off-putting manners of speech are just kind of harsh and stuff like that. Now, he definitely changes and becomes more compassionate and personable as the series goes on. But particularly at the beginning, you could say he's one of the most unlikable versions of the socially awkward character in Star Trek. Also in Voyager, Seven of Nine is more socially awkward in the Data sort of way. In terms of core issues, you could say she's kind of like a mix of Data and Charlie in terms of what's making her socially awkward. In terms of how it affects her personality-wise, she's really extremely emotional, but she despises those emotions. She despises particularly shows of emotion. And she has the kind of values that you might expect from a person who admires Data and wishes that everybody would be like Data. She does sometimes aspire to be more socially normal, but other times she despises all the traits that ordinary humans have that she either because she can't relate to them or because she sees them in herself and she hates them in herself. And once again, a mix of the kinds of things that a lot of people on the autism spectrum can relate to, as well as other people who are socially awkward for other reasons. Moving on to Enterprise. T'Pol is socially awkward, maybe kind of in a mix of the Spock variety and the Odo variety, with a little bit of Seven of Nine thrown into the mix. She has Spock's general competence and success in life, so that she's not making social blunders that are actually really costing her or really making her look silly. She's also got Odo's sense of disgust and this resultant preference to just avoid social contact because she's better than everyone else, which for Odo and for her contributes significantly to the inexperience that results in lack of social skills. And also, she's got Seven's kind of neurotic, agitated way of interacting with her own emotions. I think T'Pol really is the most neurotic Vulcan main character in all of Star Trek, partly because all the Vulcans in the Enterprise era were, shall we say, not your grandpappy's Vulcans. And in that way, T'Pol seems to me to be closer to being a Seven of Nine than a Spock or a Tuvok, and even more of a Seven of Nine than an Odo, since Odo's neuroticism tends to stay pretty well hidden for most of the series, whereas T'Pol's is much closer to the surface. So, social awkwardness has always been something that Star Trek includes in its picture. And I think socially awkward people have tended to feel a special connection to the series or the series ever since the beginning. In some ways, I think this might play into that stereotype that some of us have bumped into of the socially awkward nerd Trekkie, And I think that's probably a fading stereotype by this point now. I think probably ever since 2009, when the Star Trek franchise has been moving closer to mainstream appeal, that stereotype has probably been fading a little bit. Anyway, So my next section here, I wanted to take a minute and just think about social awkwardness as a thing. So why are people socially awkward? In real life, it seems to me there are a number of different variations or kinds of social awkwardness, and I think we see versions of most of these in Star Trek. So I'm going to list five. I'm going to call these number one, the isolation factor. Number two, the multicultural or the moving factor. Three, the neurological factor. Four, we could say lack of focus or lack of concern or something like that. And then five, I kind of threw in a miscellaneous one that's kind of more complicated. We'll get into that. So that first one, isolation. This is, if you think maybe think of the stereotypical homeschool kid like me, that was my story back long before COVID made homeschooling more normal. Um, And then this would also be that stereotype. Sometimes you see this showing up in TV shows for humor of the hillbilly who lived out in the mountains and never learned manners. You could say this would be like a recluse who's been spending years by himself, or any person who's re-entering society. Maybe he was marooned on an island, or stuck in prison, or someplace else where he didn't have the social interactions, or he didn't have normal social interactions, or any reason that would lead to somebody not getting out a whole lot, particularly during the more socially formative years of your life. That's the kind of person who's just not going to know the rules of social interaction, and especially to not know those specific rules that apply to the culture and the place that you're living in. So in Star Trek, Charlie definitely fits this category right into the mold because he hasn't been around humans for most of his life. He's young, he's a teenager. For most of the episode, we're led to believe that his early childhood didn't have any persons in it at all, though later we find out that he actually was raised by persons. He was raised by these energy beings that not only have different cultural and social norms than us, but also a completely different kind of existence. So Charlie's one. Another example that comes to mind for this category would be Barclay from The Next Generation. We don't know a lot about Barclay's childhood, but we know that as an adult, he has severe social anxiety. So probably for most of his life, he's kind of been avoiding social situations, avoiding them like the plague, doing everything he can to be able to live his professional life and manage his professional life with a minimum of socializing. And that's going to result in the same thing as what Charlie had, even though Charlie was isolated, truly isolated, but Barclay's kind of isolating himself through his social anxiety. And the result of that is that you're going to be failing to learn skills because you're not in the social context where you would be learning those skills. Another example, a more colorful example that comes to mind for this category is the Voyager episode Future's End. You might remember Starling kidnaps the doctor. He digitally kidnaps the doctor through the link that the comm link he has with Voyager, and he gets to steal all the information, and the doctor comes down with all the computer data. And so Starling hooks the doctor up to this 29th century mobile emitter, and the doctor finds himself on the streets of a 20th century Earth city with Starling and the gang. And in some pretty humorous ways, the doctor demonstrates that he doesn't know how to interact with any part of this world around him. And he's really uncomfortable. And he doesn't even know how to run without looking strange. And that's because the doctor spent his life isolated from all of the rest of life inside sick bay. And especially, particularly, he was definitely isolated from this kind of large, open city kind of world that he finds now on Earth. And so he tries to pretend to Henry Starling, he tries to pretend that he's not excited or overwhelmed. He's definitely both of those. Starling's like, yeah, you got to be excited to be getting out for the first time. And the doctor's like, oh, no, but he's lying through his teeth. Because in actuality, the doctor's overwhelmed. He feels awkward. He's never been, quote unquote, out. Another example of this category, I think, would be Seven of Nine, particularly in regard to her interpersonal social skills. There's this one series of episodes where the doctor tries to give Seven lessons in social skills. And Tom's like, man, if this isn't the blind leading the blind when he hears about that. But so anyway, for those, the goal was for Seven to be able to learn things like how to mingle with groups and parties, how to have small talk, how to enter a conversation, how to leave a conversation, how to go on a date, all that kind of stuff. And the reason she has to learn those things is because she spent her whole life isolated from social interactions within the Borg Collective, where there weren't any social interactions. Kind of like the hillbilly who spent her whole life hanging out with people she already knows and people who don't, mingle in parties and all that kind of stuff. Seven of Nine, kind of like that. She has entered society without any opportunity to learn how to mingle in a crowd, make a friend, chat about the weather, etc. So that was the first category. isolation. The second category in my list is what I just called the multicultural or the moving aspect, for lack of a better term. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking up the word I was going to use here, but you'll get the idea of what I mean pretty quick. This is kind of the transcultural awkwardness that we find when somebody enters a culture from another culture where things are done differently. So this would be quite similar to, and it would go along with culture shock. In the real world, this would often be exacerbated by the language barrier. Of course, in Star Trek, we don't have that because there's a universal translator. And this category, I think, of course, it mixes with other ones, but it would probably be one of the most common aspects of social awkwardness that we see in Star Trek. This is a factor, one of various factors, but this is a factor in Spock's awkwardness and his failure to understand humans. Because even though, yes, he is wired differently from humans, but the main source of the confusion a lot of the time is the fact that he's spent his whole life among Vulcans, who have an entirely different value system and they have different ways of interacting with one another, different expectations, etc., than humans. Back to that Voyager episode I mentioned, Future's End, where they go back to 20th century Earth. Um, this is a main factor where, if you remember when Rain Robinson said to Tom and Tuvok, she's like, everything you guys do is just a little bit off, you know? And that was because Tom and Tuvok were extremely socially awkward in that environment because they were trying to pretend to be natives, but along the way they were making these anachronistic references to the USSR. They were saying LDS instead of LSD. Basically, they were these really bright people who didn't know how to order pizza, who didn't know what the rules of traffic were. They were really bright, but they were clueless. And this was because they just came from a completely different culture where the social rules and the basic facts of society were just different. To use another enterprise example, Dr. Phlox often says and does things that are extremely socially inappropriate. And we could say it's kind of like social awkwardness, except Phlox isn't unskilled at social interaction in general, or he's not lacking social skills within his world. He's just lacking social skills among humans. So within this category, what looks like general social awkwardness is closer to what would go along with culture shock. But it's a very similar phenomenon because in both cases, it really is the lack of skills that would come from experience. The difference is in that first category, isolation, it's the general society that the awkward person is lacking experience with. Whereas in this category, category two here, it's more specifically the rules of that specific culture. That's what the person hasn't had experience with, hasn't been able to learn over time. And then the third category in my list is what I just called neurological. And by this, I'm referring to stuff like autism spectrum disorder, or as it used to be called, Asperger's syndrome. So this is a real life thing where sometimes there are neurological reasons that people have more difficulty than other people, more difficulty acquiring social skills. And then the end result of that is a kind of awkwardness that a lot of time looks a lot like categories one and two, the other two categories I just listed. The difference is that somebody who's awkward due to isolation or culture shock can usually grow out of that just by spending more time with people, more time being able to pick things up over time. But usually, someone with a more neurologically based social awkwardness is probably going to need special focused training because the ability to pick up on the social rules is actually part of the limitations. Probably the most obvious Star Trek example of this third category would be Data prior to getting his emotion chip. For Data, jokes, social norms, and the emotional experiences of others just go straight over his head. Sometimes he might try to take a role that he doesn't understand. He might try to just memorize things relevant to that and just do them precisely, but without understanding them. Now, the biggest difference here between Data and somebody on the autism spectrum is that Data actually doesn't even feel most emotions, whereas definitely being on the autism spectrum doesn't give you any less emotional experience than anybody else on the inside. The challenge is in regard to understanding those experiences, whether understanding them in yourself, understanding them in other people. But you've got the emotions, unlike Data, where there's the time when he breaks up with his girlfriend and then she leaves and then the camera stays watching Data and he says, "Hi, Spot," and he's just like completely, he just doesn't really care, because he actually doesn't have those emotions. Now, I think we could argue that Data has certain emotions, such as curiosity or interest or disappointment, desire. He's got emotions, but not ones that all humans have, such as sadness, for example, or loneliness or things like that. I think for this category, I think the Doctor in Voyager probably fits in this category a little bit, particularly in the beginning of the series. But the funny thing with the Doctor is because he is a pre-packaged hollow program, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on. You could really put his obliviousness you could put into almost any of our categories here, and it would still make some amount of sense. Another example that comes to my mind when I think of the autism spectrum in Star Trek is the Enterprise episode Carbon Creek. Now, I haven't seen this one for a long time, but my memory of the episode is that the Vulcans they portrayed in that episode, who crash landed on Earth in 1957. So this is I think it's not a time travel story. It's T'Pol remembering this old story from her grandmother or something like that. Um, but anyway, so these Vulcans, they try to pass themselves off as humans. And my memory of it, like I said, it's been a while, but the way I remember it is that they were really portrayed far less like classic Vulcans or any Vulcans, and they were portrayed like real life humans who are on the autism spectrum. And I think that was probably done intentionally to draw a connection that Star Trek fans have made probably from the beginning that those who find themselves more emotionally disconnected, those humans who find themselves more emotionally disconnected than their neurotypical friends, often find themselves relating with the Vulcans on Star Trek. And all throughout Enterprise, all the Vulcans on Enterprise have strong emotions, just like real people on the autism spectrum do. They have emotions that they just don't express or understand or naturally process their emotions the way humans do. But I think the way they used the Vulcans on Carbon Creek, at least from what I remember, it seemed like they were drawing that connection and showing us in that episode people who find themselves trying to coexist with neurotypicals and finding it to be sometimes challenging, sometimes discouraging, sometimes worth the effort. And then the fourth category I listed there is what I just called lack of focus or lack of concern, something like that. And this one can definitely sometimes overlap with the other items above it, or it could stand by itself. This is when you bump into somebody who doesn't think of themselves as socially awkward, but really doesn't mind stepping on people's toes, even if they know they're doing it. Don't mind breaking social rules, don't mind doing things that they know are inappropriate. And it's not because they don't know they're doing it, like in options 1 through 3, but it's because they actually just don't care. Sometimes I think the Doctor on Voyager probably fits into this category. Not sure, hard to tell. And I think Vulcans such as Spock or T'Pol definitely fit into this category sometimes when they're just so proud of being a Vulcan and there are certain inappropriate things that they just kind of prefer not to care about. I think Klingons, when they're in multicultural context, I think Klingons definitely fit into this category when they may know that they're breaking human social norms, but they just don't care. They think that they're just better. Another example that comes to mind is the instance in Voyager. I think it was the episode Equinox. I'm not sure about that, but there's an episode where B'Elanna, a little, very small scene, but there's a scene, it's in Astrometrics, I think, where B'Elanna confronts Seven, and she ends up just kind of saying straight out, she's like, "You're rude, Seven," and then she goes and says what she means by that. And so while I don't remember the details of how that progressed, but the impression I have in my memory is that after B'Elanna explained some of these things kind of angrily, but Seven just proceeded to argue back on each point because the things that B'Elanna was bothered about, that all humans and all people other than Seven would have agreed about, but those were things that Seven just kind of preferred to ignore, whether she always knew about them or whether she knows now that B'Elanna told her, but she just doesn't care. She doesn't feel like they matter. She feels like the problem is everybody else, not me. Now, one of the most stark examples of this category, and maybe this doesn't even fit, but it's interesting to think about, is Gul Dukat. So in Gul Dukat's interactions with everybody, but think about his interaction with Sisko, for example, Gul Dukat tends to be very rude, very socially inappropriate. And sometimes there might be some kind of cultural barrier there. We know that a lot of Cardassians are kind of arrogant and rude in certain ways. But some of it also probably relates to what we could call social awkwardness in terms of the fact that Dukat is not in charge anymore, but he's used to being in charge. But on another layer, his rudeness seems to be an intentional desire to be combative towards somebody like Sisko. But just in his personality generally, like with everybody, there's definitely a layer of something that's consistent. We could think of it kind of like social awkwardness. And this is the thing in his personality that makes almost everybody hate Dukat, whether they're Cardassian or whoever they are. But this layer, whether we want to call it social awkwardness or personality or what, I think it's something that consists of things that Dukat definitely has the knowledge and the neurological ability to change if he wanted to, but he prefers not to because he doesn't mind being abrasive and socially inappropriate by being rude and arrogant and difficult to talk to and breaking all the social rules. In fact, I think he kind of likes it a lot of the time. And sometimes, for example, probably with someone like Sisko, he's actually probably consciously trying to amp it up because he wants to make Sisko angry. And so while Dukat does that intentionally and out of ill will, I think any one of us can find ourselves in a similar kind of trap anytime you don't consciously prioritize and value the feelings of others. Anytime you don't make the effort to consistently be learning, be trying to learn habits of responding to other people's emotional expressions, other people's social expectations, etc., in a socially aware, in a considerate kind of way. And then fifthly, I just made a fifth category for some of the complicated and more confusing examples that are kind of mixing bits of all the above and you're not sure exactly necessarily what's going on. And mostly for this category, I was thinking in Star Trek of Odo, because some of Odo's what might look like social awkwardness, some of that's intentional in the fact that he just doesn't want to fit in with other people. So that'd be category four, the lack of motivation or concern. But the end result of it is that he does socially isolate himself. And so when you're socially isolated, you're going to be failing to develop certain social skills, which Odo has definitely. There are certain skills he hasn't developed, which you can see when he wants to date Kira and he doesn't know how to begin. He doesn't have a clue. Um, and then on top of that, with Odo, there's the multicultural barrier, the one I listed as category two, because Odo started his life in a lab with Bajorans, and he spent his young adulthood under the leadership of Gul Dukat, who he despised. So the result is that Odo feels very culturally out of place everywhere he looks. So in real life and in Star Trek, there's a lot of different kinds or aspects of social awkwardness. They're not all the same. And usually it's some combination of some amount of lack of experiences that you would have learned from if you had had them, or the neurological aspect that makes it hard to learn from the experiences you do have. Those are the two main things. And then, of course, there's a motivation factor where the presence of motivation or the lack of motivation can make a big difference in how that development goes, or even if it maybe doesn't even happen because you just don't see it as a priority because you weren't taught that it was a priority or whatever. There's all kinds of factors that can play in there. Okay, that was a lot. So that's just about social awkwardness, and that's relevant to Charlie because Charlie's socially awkward. Let's actually start going through the episode now. I know this video was supposed to actually be about Charlie. All right, so let's start walking through the episode. So this is Charlie X, second episode of Star Trek ever to be aired, TOS Season 1, Episode 2, and it starts when the Enterprise meets up with the cargo vessel Antares to pick up their passenger, Charlie Evans. Almost immediately after they beam on board, we almost immediately get this kind of forewarning, this clue that something's wrong about him or there's something evil about them because we get this funny little eye thing where he just kind of goes, and the music goes, scary, scary. And so I guess the team here developing this must have learned their lesson from the cage about getting rejected for being too boring for people who aren't into psychological stuff. That they need to make things really exciting and dangerous right out of the gate, make sure they hold everybody's attention. And we get right out of the gate, we get a very quick little bit of exposition of who this Charlie is. And this is when the captain who beamed on the Enterprise with them, he says, this is the line I copied out. To think this boy spent practically his whole life alone on that planet, everyone killed, just a few microtapes to learn from. So that's kind of our quick little, and he just kind of blurts it out real fast. If you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. But that's the premise that we're introduced to. In a way, we could think of the premise here as something like the space age version of the classic kind of folklore mythology concept of the feral child, someone who's raised from birth or from a very young age, raised out in the wilderness by wolves, or at least raised with little or no human contact. That was, for example, that was the legendary story about the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. The story was that they were raised by wolves, so they were feral children. A more recent story that gained a tremendous amount of popular attention was the 19th century story of Caspar Hauser, who claimed that he had spent his entire childhood in a dark cell by himself until he finally escaped, and then he found himself among people, without any idea of how to interact with people. I bumped into that story maybe a year ago or something like that through a YouTube video, which I've lost track of the video, but when you type it into Google, you get basically the same information that I got from that video. And it's really just a very bizarre and fascinating story. I think the consensus now is from historians is that that particular story was probably a hoax, but a very sophisticated, weird hoax. And it's one that captured people's attention, particularly back when it happened. And it did so. It captured people's attention by expanding on a classic kind of story, like the feral child, a kind of story that really goes back to ancient times. So anyway, There's the initial premise that we get from the captain of the Antares regarding the history of Charlie. It's basically a space age variation on that theme. Instead of being raised by wolves in the wilderness or raised in a dark dungeon by captors who never spoke to him, instead, Charlie was raised by computers on an isolated planet colony after the whole team had tragically died. We don't even know how they died, but that's not really important. So that's the premise for the life story of Charlie, and it's the premise for Charlie's social awkwardness. We get our first in-person visualizations of Charlie's social awkwardness in that first scene there. For example, we get Charlie giving this uncomfortable handshake. He's kind of like, how do I do this? Like he knows what it is, but he's not used to doing it. And then just a minute later, we get the moment where Kirk finds himself giving a kind of lighthearted reprimand to Charlie. He says, "You keep interrupting, Charlie. That's considered wrong." And he says that with kind of a nice smile. He's not being rude, but he's like, well, this kid needs to be told. Because Charlie was doing something socially wrong without knowing it. There are complicated rules that he would like to follow. It's just he's not sure what rule goes where. It's interesting on the topic of interrupting. Those two other guys from the Antares who beamed aboard with Charlie, they're constantly interrupting each other. So we realize that the social rule that Charlie is breaking, it's a bit more complicated than just the fact that you shouldn't interrupt. Maybe you could say what Kirk would mean to say if he would give more precision to it is that it's considered wrong within their culture to interrupt someone of a more higher status than yourself, and particularly to do that when you are derailing a more important social process than the one you're trying to start, when you're derailing a more important social process that needs to finish before we move on. So Charlie is saying, I want to see this or that. He's saying that while Kirk is still chatting with the Antares officers before they can beam back to their ship. And Charlie's interrupting that process. Also, in terms of social awkwardness and the intriguing dynamics in this introductory scene, what Kirk doesn't draw attention to is the kind of presumptuous implication of Charlie's words. The line is, I'd like to see your ship now. It's almost like, in a friendly tone of voice, he's commanding Kirk. So, on an intuitive level, Kirk recognizes Charlie as being rude and presumptuous. What Kirk consciously notices is the interrupting. But the actual reason under the surface for what makes that inappropriate is more of a multi-layer thing. And I think it's a helpful aspect to keep in mind is that when analyzing social awkwardness, most people can tell when someone's being socially awkward or rude or inappropriate, but that doesn't mean they'll be able to tell you exactly why or what makes it that way. It's kind of like if you know how to ride a bike and you see somebody riding a bike wrong, you can tell it's wrong, but you may or may not be able to coach the person to do it right. Because there are a lot of things that we have in life that we know without knowing how we know it. And social skills is definitely one of those things. Now, also within the greater course of the story, this opening scene also becomes interesting on another level because, number one, we realize that these officers that are quite eager to get rid of Charlie, they're kind of holding their cards close to their chest, as it were, on that topic because they're saying all these positive things about Charlie, and they're leaving out the biggest reason that they're actually in such a rush, which is let's hand off this guy and get out of here. And so, number one. And then number two, we also realized that part of the reason Charlie's social awkwardness came out in that kind of presumptuous, commanding kind of thing he said, maybe because, kind of like if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, in book six, there's Tom Riddle in the orphanage who was used to being able to command kids to do things because he had these powers. And there's probably a little bit of that going on here with Charlie, is that even though he doesn't certainly wouldn't realize he's doing this, but there's probably an aspect where he's kind of been getting used to the idea that he's able to command people to do things and they'll do them because they're scared of him, you know? Anyway, the next bit in this scene, kind of this is like transitioning to the next scene, but as they head off out of the transporter room, Kirk is handing Charlie off to Yeoman Rand, and Charlie is kind of hesitant to follow her. And then we get one of the most memorable short lines in the whole episode when Charlie says, Are you a girl? And then he turns to Kirk, Is that a girl? I think a lot of the Rand Charlie scenes are supposed to be humorous. For myself, they are humorous. Sometimes I just feel a little sad and kind of want to cringe a little bit. If I lighten up, I can laugh about it. But for this scene, um, as I was watching it this time, I was kind of thinking in my head, didn't Charlie have microtapes? Wasn't there a girl on any of those microtapes? And I thought, well, I suppose maybe those microtapes didn't have a lot of images. Maybe that's how it went. One of the kind of fun things about watching TOS and other early sci-fi like this is how we're kind of in this alternate future history kind of context, which I think is super cool. So we've got warp drive and transporters, and the computers can talk to you, but we store everything on stuff like microtapes. I'm guessing that microtapes, I don't think there's really a such thing. I don't think there was ever a such thing as microtapes. At least I couldn't quickly find anything on the internet or anything. But I'm guessing probably what it's intended to be is a combination between microfilm and cassette tapes, because early on in the early days of the computer, cassette tapes were used for storage. And the older supercomputers used, and you'll see this in a lot of sci-fi, these big giant spinning tapes. Like in Eureka, for example, the TV series Eureka, they go underneath Global Dynamics and they find this really old computer. And when they turn it on, the first thing you see, and this is what they tend to show you when they show you old computers in newer TV shows, is they show you these big, giant, rotating, spinning tapes. Um, so there's that, and we might just be thinking, well, there's just like the sci-fi version, the micro version of that. But mainly, what I think of when I hear microtape is I think of microfilm, which used to be a mainstay. I've never seen any myself, but as a kid, I read about them in books and stuff like that, where that was just something that you used in a library to show you stuff that wasn't actually on the shelf. And I think that's probably the main thing we're supposed to have in view. Like he would take a microtape, he would put it in, and then it would show the thing on the screen, so he could read the book or whatever it is. So I guess the idea is that Charlie had a collection of these little microfilm type tapes that he would put into the gadget, and then he would have stuff to read. And maybe there wouldn't be a lot of images. Maybe there would just be sparse images here and there. Anyway, so in this alternate universe, I guess it's possible to spend years and years on a colony on a planet far away, perusing computer databases, and never actually see a clear picture of a human female. And as far as Charlie's hesitance and that uncomfortable look on his face, can you just imagine how nervous Charlie would have been? Like everything up to this point, like not this point, but everything up to this point. Not just ever since he beamed on board, but probably days before they even met the Enterprise, because this is such a transition point in his life. And he's probably excited as well as intensely nervous because we all get nervous whenever we face something that's new and different and unpredictable. And particularly if it may relate to some big changes in life that could go well or could go not quite as well. And that nervousness applies even if you've got supernatural powers like Charlie. Well, we get the title sequence and then we get the captain's log. Captain's log stardate 1533.7. We have taken aboard an unusual passenger for transport to Colony Alpha 5. Charlie Evans, the sole survivor of a transport crash 14 years ago. The child, alone from age 3, has not only survived, but has grown to intelligent, healthy adolescence. And we open up with McCoy is finishing up Charlie's medical examination. He asks Charlie how he survived as a little kid after the food stores ran out. Charlie says he had been able to find some naturally growing things to eat. We later find out that's unlikely. Charlie also explains he learned how to talk via the computer's tapes. One of the intriguing early moments comes as we transition out of sickbay. They're heading out into the corridor, and Charlie kind of awkwardly and vulnerably, abruptly asks McCoy, "Do you like me?" And just like with all the other aspects of social awkwardness, it's hard to put your finger on exactly why it's so socially awkward to say that sentence. But we know that it's just not something you ask people, particularly not someone you don't know super well. And while it underscores Charlie's awkwardness, it also makes Charlie just seem young, like a little child, because the nature of the language used just kind of sounds like it's at a younger level. But whatever the case, even though it's got this creepy music to go along with it, it really is Charlie in a vulnerable and lonely kind of way, reaching out emotionally to anybody who he's hoping he can feel a little less lonely with. So he says, "Do you like me? I tried, but they didn't like me. I want people to like me." I think the simplicity of those three sentences is so revealing and such an important line for us understanding Charlie and also for having the whole tragic humanity kind of picture that the episode, I think, is written to give us. Because Charlie wants, more than anything else, to be liked, approved of, accepted. He wants to feel not quite so alone in the world. And so far, he hasn't been able to get that. Now, some of that is because His unique traits as a superhuman tend to make people afraid of him, and being powerful can definitely feed loneliness. But apart from that plot element, it's kind of like at this stage of the story, we've got kind of just a normal, really socially awkward kid. It seems to me that this is a pretty normal thing for socially awkward people, particularly for someone who can tell that people are treating him like he's saying and doing things that are wrong or socially, inappropriate. And I think the deep and passionate kind of people-pleasing tendency that Charlie's expressing here, this tendency that Charlie feels inside, I think we could say it contains elements that are both good and bad. It's good because it can not only motivate improvements in social skills, but it can also serve as a barometer of progress. Being sensitive to other people's reactions can drive your self-improvement process, and it can help you see the results of your improvements if you remain aware of other people's reactions. But where it can be a problem is when it actually just paralyzes the person. When you sense that others are made uncomfortable by you or just dislike you, and you don't know why, and you don't know what you can do about it. So you just say less, do less, avoid people more, and then you're not going to improve, and you're just going to feel more and more isolated and unliked and disliked. And of course, for Charlie, that's exacerbated by the fact that certain people also suspect him for the magical happenings and thus were afraid of him. Probably also had some fearful resentment toward him, depending how bad of things he was making happen occasionally. But unlike that Harry Potter character I referenced, the Tom Riddle character in The Orphanage, unlike that character, Charlie, when this kind of thing happens, he just feels smaller and sadder and lonelier for being disliked rather than finding it thrilling and then calculating how he can use it to gain power and make people, whatever. In that sense, you could almost say Charlie's passionate desire to be liked is almost like a redeeming quality that could make us like Charlie, could make us root for Charlie, even when he does start doing horrible things. Because we know that deep down, the thing that Charlie really wants more than anything is a safe community of social relationships with other humans that can quench his loneliness. And he would do anything for that. He just doesn't have a clue how. Well, not long after that, we get this scene where we see the first Jeffries tube in all of Star Trek. It's always fun to notice the firsts. Seems that Jeffries tubes started right here in episode 2. Of course, it's a diagonal one, like most of the ones in TOS, but it's still a Jeffries tube. In this scene, we also get a really classic nonverbal social awkwardness moment when somebody gives Charlie a greeting and he just stares with an uncomfortable, awkward smile and then walks away without responding. Got a feel for him. That kind of moment is not fun to have, particularly if you're aware that that's what's happening. Some people who have those experiences just move on without even knowing that anything happened at all. But I suspect someone like Charlie can tell there's something he ought to say or do, but he just doesn't know what it is, and he knows that he doesn't know what it is. And that's when it's the most uncomfortable to be an awkward person. Though on the bright side, that discomfort you feel also can serve as a positive indicator that you probably can develop the appropriate skills over time because you're aware of what's happening. A little bit later, we get this kind of difficult to watch scene where Charlie comes up to Rand in the corridor with, "I brought you a present." And it turns out that it was her favorite perfume. I think it was a perfume, whatever it was her favorite, which is kind of creepy. And then if that wasn't creepy enough, he continues to beg her to stay, even though she's on duty. A kind of awkwardness that suggests he's not used to having to acknowledge other people's responsibilities or anything that gets in the way of what he feels he needs. But finally, she has compassion on him because he's so desperate. She has compassion on him and compromises by inviting him to hang out in the rec room after she gets off work. And he's super eager and excited, and he slaps her on the butt as she walks by. She's shocked. She turns and reprimands him sharply. And he's just so stricken and startled and ashamed that she finally kind of softens up and says, "Well, it's okay. Just don't do it again." And then she suggests, "Well, why don't you tell Kirk and McCoy?" Because she says Kirk and McCoy or Kirk or McCoy. She probably said Kirk or McCoy. But she says, "Tell Kirk and McCoy and they'll explain it to you." you know. And Charlie goes away and he's embarrassed. And so far up to this point, other than the musical hints that something weird is going on and that one weird eye thing where Charlie goes, "Roar," but other than that, there's nothing bizarre or magical about the story. All you would have to do to make it real life would be to say that instead of being raised by computers on a planet, instead he was raised by a couple of hillbillies out in the wilderness. the story is really a pretty fairly realistic psychological character-based one. It's just kind of pulled a little bit further. It's kind of exaggerated by the outer space and by the fact that he's never been around humans. He's never seen a girl. I mean, you could have a hillbilly who was raised with a bunch of guys who had never seen a girl. You could definitely have that in real life. But anyway, it seems like the team here had they learned their lesson from what they did in the cage, and the cage got rejected. I guess they learned their lesson that even though they're telling a real life drama type story up to this point, they made sure to give Charlie the funny eyeball moment, to put in some creepy musical scores, so that anybody who's not into this kind of thing might keep on being interested. Oh, there's some creepy magical madness is going to happen. Hang on, you know. Well, anyway, the next scene here on the bridge. And, talking about social awkwardness, I guess whenever you're dealing with social awkwardness, one of the things that's going to have to come up at some point is going to be some effort at intentionally providing some kind of training of some kind. If kind of like in Voyager, when the doctor tried to give 7 social lessons, or if you think about the next generation, Data was always trying some new holo program or some new research project to get him to be a little closer to humanity. Well, in this story, this next scene here on the bridge, Kirk is saying, Dr. McCoy, Mr. Spock is working out a training program for Charlie Evans, Earth history, his own background, that sort of thing. I'd like you to give him the necessary medical orientation on the problems of adolescence. And it's a bit of a humor moment as McCoy just kind of stares and then says, well, Kirk should do it instead. He's trying to pass it off. But the assumption and the premise in the background of this humorous scene is the fact that Evans definitely does need, or at least would hugely benefit from, a whole variety of different kinds of lessons because there's all kinds of things he hasn't learned. I think it's interesting that they don't suggest someone giving him a course specifically in social etiquette or social skills. Maybe that's because they wouldn't have anyone who would actually be able to provide that kind of training, or maybe it's just because it didn't occur to them. I think the thing with social skills is that the water you're swimming in is invisible to you, especially if you've been swimming in that water your whole life. That's why if a foreigner comes up to a random American and asks him to teach them about American customs, he might very well get an answer to the effect of, wait, we don't have any American customs, because the water that you're swimming in is invisible to you, especially if you've been swimming in it your whole life or a long time. And that's why in Voyager, it's the doctor who takes it upon himself to offer 7 of 9 lessons in social skills. There is the ironic, humorous aspect that his own social skills remain questionable even to the end of the series, and that's why Tom says, "Man, talk about the blind leading the blind." But so there is that. But what makes it more than just a point of humor is the fact that those who have had to learn something due to deficiency are often the best teachers because they know what the things are that they had to learn. So so so, in other words, for people like the doctor, they can actually see the water they're swimming in because it took them a lot of effort to learn how to get into that water. And that's why a lot of the time, a prodigy at a certain skill, for example, might not be the best person to teach somebody else who's struggling with it because they don't know how they're doing it. They just do it. Kind of like in Monsters University when Sully tries to teach Mike how to growl, and he basically just says, well, just reach into yourself and just let it out, which doesn't make any sense to Mike. Because to Sully, the steps that are actually involved, all the aspects that go into it, are all invisible to him because he's not aware of the process. It's just natural to him. So, anyway, for most people, social skills are also something that's completely invisible. And most people don't have a clue what the unwritten rules are that they are actually following all the time without conscious awareness. Anyway, so that conversation on the bridge goes on. It transitions to them talking about the Thasians, who are the rumored inhabitants of Thasus, that planet where Charlie was found. These Thasians are rumored to possibly exist and are also rumored to have magical powers. And then there's this other thing that happens in that conversation. I'm always intrigued by the little bits of the Kirk, Spock, McCoy banter about logic versus emotions. And here in this scene, there's a fun little head scratcher. So Spock says, probes of Thasus indicate very little indigenous food sources. And McCoy interrupts by countering, probes have been known to be wrong. And Spock counters back, Doctor, are you speaking scientifically or emotionally? And I find it kind of amusing in retrospect. While I was watching the episode, I jotted it down as kind of a head scratcher moment. Because while I guess it's kind of a throwaway line, but it's also kind of an early exposition to Spock's aversion to what he calls emotion and Spock's laser focus on what he calls logic. But from a modern point of view, or at least from my point of view, this particular interaction kind of has a bizarre rebuttal from Spock that's almost humorous because it started with McCoy making a scientific observation that probes have been known to be wrong, and Spock counters by saying he should be more scientific and less emotional. So that's kind of amusing to realize. But on a more serious note, if Spock is saying that McCoy's emotions are guiding him, what emotions would those be? Seems that it would be something in the ballpark of trust or interpersonal relationship. In other words, maybe you could say it's McCoy's feelings about Charlie, or if you will, McCoy's read on Charlie. It seems to me like these days we don't usually use the blanket term emotion to refer to somebody's instincts about another person. Spock here seems to prefer to completely ignore all unquantifiable interpretations or aspects of evidence of the human element of the equation. It kind of reminds me of the time in Voyager when Janeway in Seven of Nine talked about intuition, and Seven defined intuition as a human superstitious belief that they can know things that they can't. So in this case, McCoy is skeptical of the probe's readings because he says scientifically probes have been wrong in the past. Spock sees that as an unscientific skepticism, and the reason is because he dismisses McCoy's unstated counter evidence, this unquantifiable and subjective thing that Spock just sees as just an emotion. And part of me wonders if maybe part of the reason Spock dismisses the unquantifiable aspects of the human element is because to him, human behavior maybe is a little opaque. Human motivation and behavior perplex him sometimes, and maybe he doesn't have any way to evaluate whether he should think Charlie can be trusted or not. Of course, Spock is right in the end, and I wonder if probably the fact that Spock's somewhat wooden and dogmatic approach here ends up being vindicated, ends up being correct. I wonder probably that probably suggests that the writers are kind of agreeing with Spock that unfeeling logic without intuition or other unquantifiable senses being involved maybe works better for the best decision making. I'm not sure. Another scene that's going to come up a little bit later might kind of go against that. So maybe they're intending there to be a little bit of a dialogue that goes in both directions. But I find it a little frustrating how McCoy is always wrong, or at least he always seems to be wrong because he's just not as smart as Spock. But anyway, the next scene we get is that one colorful scene. This is pretty memorable as well because we don't have a lot of scenes like this in TOS, but that colorful scene in the rec room where Spock is playing his electric lyre. Uhura starts singing, and Spock seemed kind of amused, maybe a little bit annoyed or a little bit kind of like, yeah, rolling his eyes, but he keeps on playing. Before long, Uhura has strung together a playful song that refers to Spock as a devil-like creature that will break women's hearts. Oh, girls in space, be wary, be wary, be wary. Oh, girls in space, be wary, i.e., be wary of Spock, who's going to break your heart. Then Charlie comes into the room, and Uhura takes the opportunity to start singing about him instead. And she describes Charlie as the special, mysterious traveler who comes along, quote, seeking his first embrace. He is saving it for you, which she says while she's looking at Rand, who Charlie is sitting with. And of course, Rand is very uncomfortable because she's had enough experience with Charlie to know that Charlie's not going to get the humor of that. And that really easy to misunderstand joke is not going to be good for Charlie's confused ears. So she just kind of subtly shakes her head at Uhura, who, on the fly, changes the song into one that's kind of opposite in tone, but is really humiliating for someone who didn't realize how young he was and didn't realize that that first verse was a joke with its aggrandizing admiration for this mysterious traveler. So we end up with Charlie's our new darling, our darling, our darling, Charlie's our new darling. Ugh, poor Charlie. You know what's funny? When the song about Spock had begun at the beginning of the scene, Spock just kind of smiled and he had this kind of shrugging look on his face. He just kept playing almost like he was rolling his eyes on the inside, but he just didn't care. He was having a good time. Very different attitude than what I might expect from, let's say, Tuvok on Voyager, who seems like he would have probably been a little more annoyed and frustrated and probably would have stopped playing and said, stop singing such illogical things. Certainly, if Neelix was involved, Tuvok would have definitely stopped and said, you're being illogical. But Spock in this scene at least has a much more congenial and pleasant attitude because of his indifference, I suppose. But in contrast to Spock's pleasant, unfazed attitude to being sung about, when the song about Charlie began, Charlie just looked really uncomfortable with all the attention. Probably not because he didn't like the sense of fun, like with Spock, but because he was really just perplexed about what to make of it. because to the socially awkward ear, that first verse that sounded like Uhura was actually praising Charlie as a wonderful and impressive person. Charlie had no frame of reference to identify what in the heck it was, whether it was a joke or an actual heaping of praise, which is why Rand became so uncomfortable with the part about seeking his first embrace. He's saving it for you. Because she knew that Charlie didn't have the social skill to read the flighty sense of humor that would decode the whole thing. And that's also why afterwards Charlie became so angry because once Uhura flipped that tail, she basically alternated a song of admiration and praise into denigration. She went from making him sound like the grandest old catch ever, which kind of made sense in context because she had just finished saying that about Spock, that Spock was the grandest old catch ever. And she just put that onto Charlie. But then she took that and she flipped it into this picture of he's this 5-year-old that all the girls are fawning over because he's so itty bitty and cute, and that's just going to feel absolutely humiliating. And Uhura didn't know she was being downright cruel, but she kind of was. Anyway, so in his anger, Charlie magically takes away Uhura's voice and she coughs and can't sing anymore. And then Charlie starts showing Rand some card tricks. Now, it's interesting how the moment he came in, so back when Uhura was still singing, he was already trying to show Rand something with the cards. He was like nudging her and like, hey, look at this, you know. And whether we see that as an element of social awkwardness in the sense of having underdeveloped conversation skills, which is definitely part of what it was, he doesn't know how to say hello and he doesn't know how to ascertain that it's not time for him to be receiving attention yet because of the way the room is going. Or whether we see it as a carryover from childhood, that he's kind of an overgrown child that hasn't phased out from that yet. Either way, his instinct, the only way he knows how to move forward interacting with someone is he wants to interact with by showing rather than trying to talk. And that would be kind of socially normal for a child. Of course, the older you get, and particularly if you do this with a minimum of words, and you're doing that to someone you don't know super well, like Charlie is here, it's kind of just one more kind of standard middle of the road portrait of social awkwardness. But anyway, so now that Uhura's done singing, he does the card trick, and all that mysterious music in the background kind of amps up in this kind of creepy, what's going on? you know, just in case the audience might be tuning out and failing to notice what's happening. And of course, when he shows the card tricks, these things are literally impossible, like the cards actually changing, and they're kind of alarming to Rand because they are fixating on her. The next scene is when Kirk's in the corridor. Charlie's going to come meet him in a minute, but before Charlie shows up, the captain is talking to someone who we can't see super well. I think something's in the way or something like that. But what he's saying to the guy, on Earth, the day is Thanksgiving. If the crew has to eat synthetic meatloaf, I want it to look like turkey. So I guess that guy off screen, he's kind of the equivalent of Enterprise's chef, from Star Trek Enterprise. Even though we can't really see his face, so he's not a character. But we never saw Chef on Enterprise either, did we? Unless you count Riker. He wasn't really Chef. He was fake Chef. We get another humor moment when Charlie asks Kirk the question about slapping Rand. And Kirk kind of just struggles. He's kind of stammering around uncomfortably. And then what he ends up saying, he's like, well, the rule is you can hit man to man, but not woman to woman, or not man to woman. But Kirk just looks like he's completely baffled about what else to say. And Charlie just kind of like stares back, totally perplexed. And finally, Kirk just like, you understand? And I guess you could interpret, of course, this is a funny part, this is a humorous part, but you could interpret it in two ways, or three if you count the comedic effect to be one way to look at it. But one aspect to notice is that this scene kind of reflects the fact that issues of interpersonal propriety loosely connected to sexuality were still pretty uncomfortable back in the late 60s, and that's part of the source of the humor. For example, every time any of the characters would come to the part of the sentence where you would use the word butt or bum or something like that, whatever word you would put in there, they would always pause and then be unable to continue, which is supposed to be the humor moment, because that's not a word that you use. And the reason it's funny is because our characters don't know how to talk about something that you aren't allowed to talk about. Contrast this to the early 2000s when on Star Trek Enterprise, Reed casually comments to Tucker about how good looking T'Pol's bum is. Now, of course, it's not like Reed would have said that casually to just anybody, but it's also the case that he faces no discomfort with the actual word. Any awkwardness or nervous tension in that scene is not because the word is taboo, but rather because it's a fellow crew member that he's talking about. Whereas the humor in Enterprise with Reed's social awkwardness around women That humor would more likely involve the audience laughs because of how much Reed is going to casually say flippantly about sex. Whereas the humor back here in the 60s in this episode, it's more about how little Kirk or Rand are able to say when it's actually necessary. And I think that kind of reflects a change in the culture, both in terms of what's considered funny and also just the change in terms of how explicitly or how frankly this kind of stuff is talked about. So that's one way to think about the scene, one interesting set of things that you might notice. The second way to interpret the scene, and I think both of these are true, but the second aspect is like what I said earlier about the water you swim in. The person who's going to be effective at teaching a socially awkward person is going to have to be someone who either was socially awkward himself or someone who spent a lot of time thinking about those kinds of issues. And I think part of the humor here with Kirk is that Kirk has never tried to verbalize or even think about what kind of rule this is that we're talking about here. He's never thought about something as fundamental as not slapping random girls on the butt. If the question had instead been Charlie saying, "Why shouldn't I have said that the dinner looks funny?" If it was something like that instead, Kirk would have still been equally baffled. He would have been a little less uncomfortable about it. He would have been a little less stammery, but he still would have been baffled and he still would have struggled for an answer. Because just like knowing the grammar of your own language or knowing how to go about ordering a meal at a restaurant, you're just not aware of things that are so fundamental to living that you never think about them. You can't identify or describe the water you swim in unless you've been outside that water before, or unless you spend a lot of time talking to people who've been outside that water. Anyway, so Kirk asked him, "You understand?" And it's quite clear the answer was going to be some version of no, but we don't get to see the conversation keep going because they are interrupted by the intercom, and Uhura notifies Kirk that the captain of the Antares is on D channel. So Kirk heads up to the bridge, and the captain of the Antares tries to warn Kirk about something, but then gets cut off. And as Spock tries to, read the ship's sensors and say, what's going on here? And then finally they realize, oh, wait, that debris is the Antares. The Antares has become a pile of debris when we weren't noticing. And then a comment Charlie makes, well, it wasn't constructed very well. It kind of seems to imply that he knew what kind of thing happened before anybody else did. And then meanwhile, the galley calls up to Kirk and says that he put meatloaf in the ovens, but there's turkeys in there now, real turkeys. And Charlie snickers and walks off the bridge. Well, he snickers and Kirk notices, and then Charlie walks off the bridge. Now, when I watched this sequence this time around, I assumed that Kirk suspected Charlie on both of those accounts. Maybe he didn't, because some of the later conversations put that into question. And I'd have to watch it again for me to be sure on that. But anyway, part of what makes that bit with the turkeys kind of important and almost kind of contributes to the oh no, what's going to happen kind of vibe. They don't particularly draw attention to it, but if you're paying attention, it kind of adds a frightening element because the fact is that Kirk told that galley officer about Thanksgiving. He said that right before Charlie walked up, which means that the moment of revelation that comes out in the episode shows the watcher at that point, if you're paying close attention, regardless of whether Kirk noticed it or not. I don't know if Kirk did or not, but the watcher at least is allowed to notice that this means Charlie can and does magically eavesdrop when he's not even there, kind of as a matter of habit. So you may not be able to have conversations about Charlie without a pretty big risk of him hearing those conversations. So the very next scene is Kirk and Spock talking about all this over a chess game. So anyway, this scene here with Spock and Kirk playing 3D chess. It's the first time we see 3D chess, which is going to become a bit of a mainstay on and off of TOS. And it's kind of funny because each Star Trek series has its own nice little collection of fictional games for the characters to sit and play, having a conversation over. So it's 3D chess for this series. In Voyager, we've got Calto and Codiscot. In DS9, we've got electric darts and electric racquetball. In the Next Generation, we had Stratagema, which showed up in that one episode. It was that finger game that the one alien played with Data, and Data beat him. I mean, that's not really the same thing because it was just one episode. But and maybe there's other ones for Next Generation that I'm just not thinking of because every other series has a bunch of these. But anyway, here in episode 2 of TOS, we get introduced to 3D chess, the space age board game that our characters can sit and have conversations over. But anyway, since we're coming right off of that last scene, Makes sense that the first thing that happens is for Spock to say to Kirk, "Your mind is not on the game, Captain." The captain explains that his mind is on the Antares, and Spock suggests the more immediate concern might be the boy. Kirk says, "I can usually follow you, Spock, but this time I can't." And Spock says he seemed to know what happened to the Antares before we did. And Kirk says, "I'd call that a pretty long reach for evidence, Mr. Spock." And so my first thought as I was watching through the episode was, well, I guess I was wrong about Kirk noticing because it seems like he doesn't suspect Charlie. But then I remembered the whole thing with the turkeys and thought, well, maybe Kirk just knows that Charlie could be listening. So Kirk maybe would knows that he would do well not to let Charlie know or to let Spock know that he knows because Charlie could be listening. But that said, it doesn't seem to me like Shatner was really playing Kirk like that in this scene. It did kind of seem like Kirk's dialogue here was really presented as being casual and upfront and just him being, saying what was on his mind. So I don't know. I think Kirk may have really just not drawn those connections at this point. Spock noticed because Spock is kind of a Sherlock Holmesy kind of character who notices these unlikely clues and things, but Kirk didn't notice because he wouldn't think of that. Anyway, so then the captain checkmates Spock, and Spock says, "Your illogical approach to chess does have its advantages on occasion, Captain." And Kirk says, "I prefer to call it inspired." And back to the discussion of intuition. Seems like that's the kind of thing the captain means by the word inspired. And Spock definitely relies on intuition. When he, for example, when he notices that thing with Charlie, there's definitely an intuition part playing for that. Maybe he interacts with his intuition differently than Kirk does, but he clearly isn't using, this cleanly sequential logic to notice things like what he noticed there. Because what Charlie said was it wasn't built well, after they lost the transmission. So if we're just talking like sequential logic with no intuition and no kind of jumping to conclusions or kind of just feeling things out, with pure logic, we would just say, well, since humans don't have magical powers, logic, I would think, would dictate that Charlie must have meant that the communication system wasn't built well and it must have broken down in the middle of the communication. I mean, after all, to invoke Mr. Holmes, if you exclude the impossible, then what remains must be, in this case, must be possible. So it's impossible for humans to have magical powers. Therefore, it seems to me it'd be more appropriate to supply a simpler hypothesis. And all my point is that Spock's not using pure logic without any intuition or without any unquantifiable, just kind of sense of the situation. Things like reading the room, things like getting a sense for the interpersonal vibes being cast by facial expressions and all this kind of stuff. It's clearly, well more going on. Maybe there's also a part of me when Kirk says what a leap of logic Spock made. Maybe there's a little part of me that's kind of going, "Aha, take that, you Spock monster." Since just a couple scenes ago, Spock was accusing McCoy of being unscientific and emotional for making an observation based on intuition. And now Spock is the one being unscientific and making leaps of logic based on how he reads Charlie. I guess maybe there's a cruel part of me that wants to say, "Aha, take that, Spock. You deserve to be refuted by Kirk. Look at you being all unscientific and trying to read Charlie and pass that off as logic." Whoa. Uh, and it does seem to me that in the whole Spock versus McCoy thing, at least some of the time, it seems like the contest really isn't about logic versus emotion. Of course, there's a lot of that. There's some of that, but it seems like the real question is more just about who's the sharpest tack in the box. And of course, Spock is going to win all the time because his IQ was just off the charts. Anyways, Charlie comes in. Spock and Charlie play chess. Spock checkmates, and then Charlie is really angry. He's abnormally angry. Kind of a little bit of a warning sign there. Spock leaves, and Charlie destroys the chess pieces with his mental powers. Then Charlie walks the corridor, and he bumps into Janice, who introduces him to Tina Lawton, yeoman third class, who's a little closer to his age. After he expresses his disinterest and Tina leaves, Yeoman Rand reprimands him for being unkind, and she says, you're going to have to get used to what it means to interact with other people rather than just computers. And Charlie goes on to express his feelings for her with lines like, "All the other girls on the ship, they'd look just like Tina. You're the only one." And lines like, "If I had the whole universe, I'd give it to you." And the scene finishes with him telling her with passionate sincerity, "When I see you, I feel like I'm hungry all over. Hungry, do you know how that feels?" And the camera zooms up on her really worried face. And then on the bridge, Rand tells Kirk about some of this, and she describes her concern as being a concern about not wanting to hurt Charlie. Kirk acts like it's not a big deal. He's just kind of like, yeah, kind of laughs about it. But presumably, I mean, you would think both of them would have some kind of understanding of what's going on. At least Rand would. I think Kirk may actually genuinely not have a clue, but Rand definitely does. And Kirk agrees to talk to the boy. She walks away and he's got kind of this smirk on his face, which is part of that's the kind of stuff that makes me think, yeah, I really think Kirk really doesn't know what's going on. In a way, there's almost a nightmare aspect to that particular scene with Rand, or at least there would be if they played it, for that. They didn't, but I think it's the ideas of the scene have kind of a nightmare aspect to them, and just the kind of double reality kind of psychological aspect. Because Rand tells Kirk that she's concerned about hurting Charlie's feelings, but that's a really censored version of what her concerns actually are. She's terrified of him. She brought Tina to Charlie as though it was this favor she was doing for him, but but that was her terrified attempt to gingerly detach herself from him without creating an explosion. Now, of course, it's not a horrifying scene because they don't play it up for that, but and the actors are pretty surface level for a lot of the episode, except for Rand. But the concepts are still kind of intriguing and playing into that kind of situation. And I think the Rand subplot does have kind of a disturbing horror-esque aspect if you think about it from her point of view. It's kind of like she's kind of like a victim of abuse with elements of gaslighting in the sense that you can't say the truth. And if you do say it, no one's going to believe you. And who knows what's going to happen. So she very carefully shares her concerns with the captain, but she leaves out the most important parts. And the captain, whether because he's pretending or I think more likely because he actually is oblivious, he just kind of chuckles at her concerns, which is the exact sort of surreal thing you might expect in a nightmare. Everybody's fooled and no one's going to help you. Anyway, everything from that point on just goes downhill. It's such a sad, frustrating story as what's going to happen is Kirk and Charlie's relationship just crumble and Charlie ending up completely out of control. The next scene is with Kirk and Charlie in Kirk's quarters. The captain starts by asking Charlie about the destroyed chess pieces, and he brings up Rand. And along the way, Charlie expresses that he feels everything he does is wrong. I wrote down this quote. He says, I don't know what I am or what I'm supposed to be or who. No wonder I hurt so much inside all the time. What a priceless moment of vulnerability for Kirk to take and build a bond and connection and mutual trust with this kid. But instead, Kirk kind of dismissively invalidates Charlie, saying this is just normal, uninteresting adolescence. Kirk's tone is like his vocal volume is gentle, but his tone and the kind of thing he's saying is invalidating and demeaning. Charlie's basically reaching out desperately for someone to hear him and understand his agony, and Kirk is basically just telling him to man up and get over it. It seems to me that Kirk is under the delusion that he understands Charlie. He's under the delusion that Charlie has no experience that Kirk hasn't also had, and Kirk is so wrong in that it's egregious. But anyway, the interaction goes on, and they end up talking specifically about Rand, which was what needed to be talked about. And eventually the hard truth comes across, and then Charlie just completely falls apart when he realizes that she's not into him and she's never going to be. And he had to be told that very clearly and explicitly because with his social awkwardness in combination with this is his first limerence, and there's kind of a blindness that tends to come with the limerence type experience. But anyway, he had to have it said straight out because he didn't have the ability to realize it unless it was said as clearly as possible. And anyway, Kirk has at least one good idea, and Kirk suggests Charlie goes with him to the gym. Problem is, going to the gym in this case, instead of meaning getting some physical activity, instead, in this case, going to the gym means trying to get Charlie to do skills he doesn't have, meaning just more frustration for Charlie, just more feelings of inadequacy and patheticness. Now, if Kirk and Charlie had been able to keep on working and trying this stuff, the throws and everything, if they had been able to do that until Charlie actually started to build these skills and gain a sense of mastery, well, then eventually it would have got somewhere good. And that would have been better than nothing. Because Kirk's broad idea of, okay, well, what this kid needs is to go to the gym. I mean, at core, that was a good idea. Problem was, it never was able to get to that point of serving that purpose. And worst of all, they weren't alone there in the gym. Because Kirk tries to show Charlie some moves. And when Charlie keeps getting knocked down, this other guy just starts laughing and keeps laughing even after Charlie tells him to stop. And finally, Charlie loses it and zaps the guy. Guy vanishes. And that really marks the end of any hope for Charlie and Kirk. Because the moment that happens, Kirk loses it. I mean, for obvious reasons, it kind of makes sense for Kirk to lose it. Charlie just zapped away a crew member. Kirk demands to know where the guy went. And after he gets some vague answers from Charlie, he ends up calling security to take Charlie to his quarters. And Charlie resists them. I mean, surprise, surprise, like really. And then Kirk just demands that Charlie goes to his quarters. I mean, like, what? Ever since the first time I saw this as an adult, I mean, I saw it as a kid and I saw it as a teenager, but ever since the first time I saw this as an adult, I've always thought like this whole sequence here, Kirk's way of handling Charlie, especially starting right here, is just so unthinkably blundering. The kind of low EQ, brutish forcefulness that Kirk tries to use here. I mean, it's probably really just a relic of its time, but it seems like Kirk is so used to being a wielder of power that he doesn't know how to do anything else. He doesn't have a clue what's going on in the mind of this socially awkward, scared, wants people to like him kid like Charlie. I mean, he already demonstrated that back in his quarters, the way he flippantly tried to handle Charlie's emotional outbursts. But anyway, finally, Kirk says, "Go to your quarters or I'll pick you up and carry you there." I guess you could say that what he's doing is he's banking a lot of weight on his authority, which has meant a lot to Charlie up till now. Or maybe a better way to think of it is maybe it'd be a little more concise just to say that Kirk is just blundering like a madman because Kirk doesn't have a clue what else to do. Charlie says, "I won't let you." Who's surprised at that? And then Kirk finally says something good. He says, "That's your choice, Charlie." Oh, finally, Kirk gave at least one good line. There won't be many of those. But that's when Charlie starts thinking about going. And then finally he goes hesitantly and dejectedly. The next scene is with Kirk meeting with Spock and McCoy in the conference room. And they're talking about the situation. They draw this connection between Charlie's powers and these reports about the Thasians' powers. And they think, oh, there's probably. And they talk about the nature of the situation. They talk about the unpredictability of Charlie's adolescent emotions, the uncertainty of the situation. And then we get this interesting exchange. McCoy says, "Well, for the moment he's stopped. You're an authority he respects, Jim." And Spock says, "Agreed. The struggle must remain between you and him. Should any of us interfere," and that's when Charlie enters the room. But it's really unfortunate that this is the explanatory paradigm. Kirk's approach up to now has been to be strong and authoritative and forceful, to demand cooperation, and if something isn't going well, just push harder. And McCoy and Spock here imply that Kirk's use of power up to this point has been what's been keeping Charlie at bay. Whereas we may notice in that last scene in the gym, none of Kirk's blustering shows of power did any good. In fact, Kirk's cold, demanding, and commanding, it really just increased the resistance. The only line that Kirk used that improved the relationship and gave any hope or moved anything in the right direction was the line where he said, "That's your choice. It's your choice." And what none of these three seem to be realizing is that when someone's defiant and someone's feeling unheard and trapped, taking away their choice with demands and commands is going to make them just fight harder. But giving choice or assuming choice or describing choice, that does the opposite. And of course, not even to mention the fact that the things Charlie really craved the most were things like compassion, love, attention, affection, being liked, which are all just being completely ignored for power. So anyway, now that Kirk is armed with this reinforcing of his power mindset that McCoy and Spock just reinforced, now Kirk is facing Charlie, who just walked into the room. And Kirk demands Charlie give an answer as to whether he's responsible for what happened to the Antares. Charlie tells the truth. And he explains, "They weren't nice to me. They wanted to get rid of me. They don't know." And Kirk says, with this demanding look on his face, "What about us, Charlie?" And Charlie says, the truth once again, "I don't know." Well, on the bridge, they try to contact a nearby colony when the comm panel blows. Then they find out they can't make course changes. Charlie comes onto the bridge and makes it known that he's in charge. Kirk demands he release navigation. This whole scene is just so psychologically painful to watch. Then there's the kind of funny part where Spock is reciting poetry under Charlie's control. Of course, Charlie's snickering. Kirk is not amused, and he finally says, "Leave my crew alone." And then there's a pause, and Charlie looks sad and walks away. It reminds me a lot about Charlie's comments earlier about his felt need to please others, for people to like him earlier on. Except Kirk seems to have no clue that that's what's going on here. Now, Spock maybe has some clue about it because his next comment is, "Jim, he'll soon reach a point where he won't back down." And I'm just thinking, you don't say. Kirk says, "I know." Well, Charlie's mad now. He's going down the corridor. He passes Tina and he turns her into a lizard. He ends up going into Rand's quarters, which makes a lot of sense because he's feeling so absolutely awful. And the romantic, the kind of limerence type feeling he has, and just the positive feelings because Rand is just a nice person. That's the one thread of his life that gave him the most positive feelings of anything else in the whole universe. And so in his misery, it makes a lot of sense that he homes in on that one thing, that one person who he desperately is hoping might make him feel better. And I say a thing and a person because I think those are both quite visibly involved here because not only is limerence involved, that's the thing, this falling in love experience, these positive feelings, the flooding of the chemicals in your body and just the euphoria. That's part of it. I mean, maybe the main driver here, but there's also this other factor. There's this person factor. There's the fact that she is the only compassionate and understanding person that he has interacted with his whole stay on the ship here. But anyway, because he let himself into her room that was locked, so she resists him on a number of levels. Finally, Kirk and Spock arrive and run into the room, and then it ends up with her slapping Charlie, and then in his shock and his anger, he zaps her into thin air. After which he turns to Kirk and Spock, and now he's really mad because now he's lost everything. And so he's demanding cooperation from Kirk and Spock. He's doing various things to demonstrate his power over them. I think he kind of temporarily breaks Spock's legs or something like that. Anyway, things go on. They try putting Charlie into a force field. It doesn't work. He just gets more mad and he walks off in a terrible mood and he's going down the hall doing these horrifying things. He turns some random girl old and she's screaming in terror. He bumps into this crowd of laughing people and he wipes their faces bare so they don't have faces. They just have blank skin on their face. And this is the part that really feels like a nightmare, or, it's kind of like this is the family-friendly horror story part of the story. And then, you know, here's what's so interesting about this whole section of the story with Charlie going crazy and with losing control and everything. It seems like the characters don't realize, Kirk particularly, but even Rand, people don't realize that the moment you yell at Charlie, you kind of lose all your bargaining power because power doesn't mean anything to him. Being liked matters to him. I'm not sure he ever cared that much about Kirk as an authority figure in terms of authority kind of respect. I think it was Kirk as a father figure that mattered to him. He wanted Kirk's approval. And every time Kirk used up his emotional bank account, as it were, it's not just that he was pushing his limits with Charlie, he was literally throwing out the only capital that he had. Kind of like sailors who are having a hard time in a storm. So to make the ship lighter, they throw out the oars and they throw out the compass, they throw out the wheel and the sails, and last of all, they throw themselves out. It's kind of like that's what was happening. That's exactly what Kirk and the others do in this episode when they try to coldly start yelling at Charlie and declare basically that he is unwanted and unliked. He's in the box of the bad people. That kind of black and white abandonment or rejection or whatever you want to call it. It's them attempting to get control, but it's actually the quickest way to lose it. Because they're giving away the only capital that they ever had to bargain with, his being liked by them, or any sense of his belonging, or sense of approval, or being understood. Fact is, they're kind of blind to his one, if we want to think of it as kind of his redeeming quality, or at least a very driving factor in his psyche, the fact that he is fundamentally pro-social. He's not your stereotypical angry psychopath who just wants to see other people suffer. He's a people pleaser who wants their attention. And he wants friendship and smiles and approval more than anything else in the whole world. And he would probably do anything for those things. In a way, this is kind of the opposite of the salt vampire from the previous episode, the man trap. Because in that episode, Professor Crater made the mistake of thinking that the salt vampire valued and felt a need for his affection. But the salt vampire had no such inclinations and needs, and the salt vampire killed Professor Crater without hesitation as the payment for his loyalty, for sticking up for him. The payment was, well, why don't I suck the salt out of you and leave you dead on the ground, dead on the floor, you know? But here, the crew are basically treating Charlie as though he is this cold, calculating salt vampire, when in reality, he's just craving and thirsting for just one kind word, for just one pat on the shoulder, for just one person to say, man, it must hurt what you're going through, or for one person to say, Charlie, I'm sorry, but, you know, and I hate to say it, but, not that Kirk deserved to lose his command or anything like that, but there is definitely a limited way in which it does kind of seem like Kirk kind of did it to himself. I'm not saying that Kirk has a moral deficit and that's what led to this, just that there's kind of this, we could say, a lack of social intelligence, which is kind of ironic because Charlie's identity is that Charlie's the socially awkward person who's lacking social, awareness, social intelligence. But the fact is, Kirk here, just by virtue of, being normal, like I think this is kind of normal, particularly in the way people thought in the 60s. Like that's the way people act in TOS. But in a way, in retrospect, as we look at it, or at least as I look at it, it seems like there's kind of a normal, quote unquote, a normal lack of social intelligence that ends up making the difference between being able to negotiate with Charlie and the difference between that and kind of making Charlie into this horror story version of Charlie who is removing people's faces as he walks by and doing all these nasty things. Anyway, next thing that happens, Kirk suggests maybe if we turn on all the ship systems so that Charlie has more to keep managed, so he won't have enough psychic energy to zap someone away if he's having to keep the whole ship, under his control. Kind of a typical TOS type strategy for overcoming a super alien. For me, I think this particular strategy seems a little dubious because after all, it seems to me Charlie wouldn't necessarily have to keep his mind power over the whole ship, just the helm, you would think. But anyway, within the story, this seems to work in the end. As that plays out and Kirk and Charlie end up kind of tussling for a minute. But there's one interesting moment during the confrontation that follows in which Kirk is kind of attacking Charlie, and Charlie is fighting back with his mind powers by blasting Kirk with this pain. And when he does, when Kirk kind of, and Charlie just apologizes with real emotional distress. He's like, I'm sorry. And he does it again because Kirk comes after him and then he stops him with that pain burst. And then Charlie's like, I'm sorry. I think that's kind of a visual story element. I mean, it's so near the resolution of the story, but I think it's such an interesting visual of the character and personality traits that Charlie's representing. Charlie's primary way of relating to Kirk, I think, had little or nothing to do with, the admiration of Kirk for his power or impressiveness kind of thing. Because even after Charlie has exerted his authority over Kirk, so Kirk has been dethroned, Charlie's on top. That power factor, the admiration factor, is gone. But he still likes Kirk, and he still really, really, really wants Kirk to like him. And his instinct is to keep on saying sorry when he causes harm to this person he likes, this person who has meant something to him, this person he wants to have things go well for him. Well, anyway, at that point, they finally get that message from the aliens on Thasus. The message finally gets through. And then suddenly Rand appears on the bridge. The aliens bring her back, and she appears on the bridge. Suddenly they're able to see this ship. Spock says it has no solid substance, according to the sensors. And Charlie says, no, please, don't let them take me. I can't live with them anymore. And then that green face appears on the bridge, the Thasian. The sudden role reversal and the sudden reversal of Charlie's attitude really makes the ending of the story really striking because it's so sudden. The change is so sudden. And I think it's probably intended to be saying something about the relationship between behavior and situation. Charlie's behavior just flips because it was highly dependent on the situation. Well, Charlie is just begging the crew to let him stay. And as he does, I think it's kind of interesting how he slowly steps toward Kirk and he kind of grabs a hold of his arm. I think there's something kind of rich about that because this is the one person that Charlie has kind of clung to, in a manner of speaking, ever since the beginning. And he still does so, in fact, literally at the end here. He literally clings to him and grabs a hold of his arm as he begs him to keep him on board. because all the conflict, all the battling with Kirk, it didn't make him hate or despise Kirk, which is also why just a minute ago he kept on apologizing every time he hurt Kirk. And now that the Thasians have shown up, he turns desperately to Kirk as that one person who he is hoping he has some hope from. Well, anyway, the green face explains, and I wrote this out. The green guy, the Thasian, says, I have taken my form centuries ago so that I may communicate with you. We did not realize until too late the boy had gone, and we are saddened that his escape cost the lives of the first ship. We could not help them, but we have returned your people and your ship to you. So, presumably, those terrified people down in the corridors who lost their faces or who got turned into iguanas or who aged 60 years, well, I guess they've just been chilling in their altered form all the way up till now. Oh, crap, those poor guys. But anyway, the green guy, he finishes and he says, everything is as it was. And Charlie, he's just begging Kirk. He says, I won't do it again. Please, I'll be good. I won't do it again. And as Charlie begs, finally Kirk says to the guy, he's like, the boy belongs with his own kind. And the guy says, that'll be impossible. Kirk says, with training, he can learn to be part of our society if he can be taught not to use his power. And the guy says, we gave him the power so that he can live. He will use it always, and he would destroy you and your kind, or you would be forced to destroy him to save yourselves. Kirk says, is there nothing you can do? And the guy says, we offer him life, and we will take care of him. And then we get Charlie's tragic final words. He says, oh, please don't let them take me. I can't even touch them. And then he's kind of walking by Janice and he says, Janice. And he kind of reaches out for her and he says, they can't feel. They don't love. Not like you. Please, I want to stay. And then his voice echoes, stay, stay, stay. And he fades away, you know. And that's how it ends. A very striking and theatrical ending with Charlie's terrified begging for help and then his being whisked away while his haunting voice echoes where he stood. In some ways, this story definitely reminds me a little bit of the episode that's going to follow it, where No Man Has Gone Before, which was actually the first episode that they ever made after The Cage. They just decided to air it as the third one. But it kind of reminds me of that. You know, it's about the bad things that happen when a person is kind of made into a god. In that episode, it's more about the power corrupts kind of concept, since in that case, it's an adult who, once he has the power, his values kind of change the more he tastes the meaning of his new powers. In this case, it's more of a tragic story of how the emotional turbulence of adolescence and situational distress and social confusion, how that would play out if the struggling adolescent had the power that every adolescent wishes he had. You know, the power struggle between Kirk and Charlie isn't all that different from how a father or a teacher might be interacting with an actual teenager. The difference is that the real life teenager isn't going to be able to get the upper hand and keep it with all this power. You know, the real teenager can't, quote unquote, make them regret it the way Charlie did have the ability to do. And then another aspect, I don't know if it was intentional for this episode to expose or to emphasize the tragedy of the unskillful handling of Charlie, but I think that is another aspect of the episode that comes through, particularly to a modern viewer like myself, particularly when there was a point when I took a break before I watched the final part of the episode. I was kind of in the middle and I took a break. And I was just so struck as I was reflecting on it. I was so struck by this collection and this piling up over time of all these things that happened, the unintended cruelty of Uhura in her singing, the misguided allowance for mixed signals by Rand, Kirk's really insensitive, dismissive handling of Charlie's various forms of distress, and then the worst part in the end, Kirk's really cold, heavy-handedness the moment he found out what Charlie was capable of doing. You know, and just kind of reflecting on all those things and how they piled up to make Charlie feel awful and feel like he is alone and nobody's on his side, nobody cares about him. And as I reflected on it, it just started to feel more and more like the tragic history of a supervillain. You know, everybody collectively accidentally put him on this trajectory without knowing it. Now, of course, you could say maybe everyone's insensitivity and all that, maybe it just accelerated the situation. You could say being as young as he was, being the fact that he just went through puberty, all these other factors, you know, you could say there would have eventually come some point when he was going to zap somebody he didn't like. You know, it was going to go badly anyway. It just, all this tragic stuff just kind of accelerated it. But the great tragedy, I think, in this episode is that even though Charlie was the socially awkward person who didn't have any first person experiences with love or compassion or human touch or conversation or social etiquette, it was actually everyone else's lack of social intelligence that marked the progress, the progression of the episode toward its tragic end. Charlie certainly failed to understand everybody else but everybody else failed to understand Charlie. Everybody else failed to treat him in a minimally respectful way. Not because they were malicious, but just because they didn't have a clue what he was experiencing. I mean, it was written all over his face, and presumably they saw the thing on his face, but they just didn't know what to do with it. And then in the end, Charlie goes back to the Thasians, back to the place where he just has to feel lonely among others because nobody's like him. And he's relegated to spending the rest of his life among the unfeeling, untouchable, unrelatable, cold gods of Thasus, who keep him alive and take care of his needs, but they aren't human. And he's terrified of that. He's terrified of being alone among others forever. And I guess maybe that ending is supposed to remind us by antithesis of the beauty of humanity, the goodness of the life that we are allowed to live, the gift of not being with the Thasians forever, the gift of not having Charlie's supernatural powers, which we have all wished for when we were young, angry adolescents, yelling at somebody or throwing a tantrum or whatever, especially, as kids when you're throwing a real tantrum. And even though the original series of Star Trek, as a child of its time, it has a relative dearth of characters with real compassion or empathy, like we'll see later in later Star Trek. I think it is clear, or at least I see it in the final sequence, that there's something that they are showing us. There's something that Charlie sees in humanity that the Thasians lack, in which he sees more in Rand than in anyone else. And he refers to it as feeling and love. And I think what he was noticing was natural compassion and empathy, and a disposition that tends to understand, or at least try to understand, other people. The opposite of the cold, booming Thasians who are generally actually invisible and you can't even touch them. And I think we actually get to see this visually in that last bit there, because when Charlie turned toward Rand and he kind of redirected his begging toward her as he walked past her, and without even meaning to, she instinctively began to step toward him until McCoy pulled her back to stop her from doing so. And I think that was because those are her impulses. And I think that's one of the vivid parts of the humanity that Charlie's so terrified to lose forever if he goes back to the Thasians. Because at this point, I think it has relatively little to do with his crush. Of course, he probably still has some feelings for her, but the thing is, she already gave him that solid rejection. She slapped him, he blasted her away. So now I don't think it's so much that. Right now, I think what he is looking at when he sees her, what he's meaning when he redirects his begging toward her and kind of toward everybody in light of, you know, what he's seeing when he looks at her, I think it's her compassion and her humanity that he's talking about. And I think in general, humanness was what Charlie had found there on the Enterprise that he was so terrified of losing. Being around people who can smile, who can laugh, who can put an arm on your shoulder or tell a joke with you, share a meal, make you feel included, appreciated, most of all, make you feel liked. Ethereal spirit beings with power and with a great sense of justice and cold goodness are a poor substitute for human community and togetherness and understanding and company. And as we think about how this episode can be thought of as giving us kind of a pleasant reminder of all the things that we've got that Charlie doesn't, we've also got, most of us at least, we've got some amount of the kind of training content that Charlie needed and he never got. We get to go through our lives without having everyone looking at us funny, singing cruel songs about us without meaning to, like Uhura. Like Charlie said, everything I do is always wrong. And that's how he felt. That's what he was experiencing. And he never got to live past that because he left. Any chance he had was done. And those of us who have been among humans our whole life, usually we have at least some semblance of some kind of social life. Now, some of us struggle like Charlie did and may have to wrestle with one or more of the 5 different kinds of social awkwardness that I mentioned in my introduction. A lot of people have to work through those, but unlike Charlie, every single one of us is allowed to keep on trying to understand others and to learn to interact with others better over time. Unlike Charlie, who had to go live with the incorporeal Thasians. And when I say interact better as a goal, I mean learn skills to interact in a way that involves less discomfort for either or both parties. Let's say in a conversation or in a social interaction. At the beginning of the episode, that's the goal that Charlie was at the beginning of his journey of learning to master those things. In his interactions with others, his social awkwardness would result in discomfort for either himself or the other person, or for both of them. And that was what caused his sense of being a failure all the time. He wanted so badly to be liked and approved of, but even his most well-intended actions were seen as wrong or inappropriate, caused discomfort to others and or to himself. But the thing is, Charlie's journey of growth was permanently stopped suddenly because he had to go live with the Thasians. He had no opportunity to, let's say, go get an appointment with a counselor, go attend a social skills group, go start reading a book on the subject, or even, for that matter, just keep blindly trying and failing, but maybe doing a little bit better each time, possibly. He couldn't do any of that. He lost it all. And none of us have completely lost all chance to keep learning and growing in those ways. But maybe the biggest thing that we can be reminded of by how different we are from Charlie, maybe it's just the simple fact that each one of us is small. Each one of us is limited and finite and weak. Each one of us has a limited amount of power, and in many cases, but not all cases, that power is commensurate with our stage of development and it's appropriate for our appropriate role in the world. We may fantasize about being able to skip some difficult task or being able to make somebody suffer for being mean to us, or we might fantasize about becoming invisible when you're embarrassed, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we don't really want to be like Charlie. Not if we really realize what that means. If we really think about it, we'd much rather be human than be Charlie for one day in a week. Now, as the logic of the following episode is going to allude to, where no man has gone before, sometimes people do have too much power in the real world. That's a different issue that can make life difficult as well. As the saying goes, power corrupts. I think Kirk or somebody actually says that quote in that episode. But for the rest of us, whether we've got this little bit of power that we're kind of bumbling around trying to do our best with, like Kirk and Spock do, or whether we have maybe a little more that we have to manage as best we can, like the Thasians, or whether maybe we just have a very tiny amount of power, like Rand and like that laughing man in the gym. However much power we have, maybe this tragic story here can remind us to be grateful for however much or however little you have, and to be thinking carefully about how to handle what you have. Kirk bumbled with his use of power. Rand found herself really frustrated with how impossible it was, how difficult it was to manage this drawing power that she had with Charlie. That man in the gym, man, he had no clue what kind of power he had, and he totally blew it. But the list goes on because we all have some power, whether we want it or not, every one of us. And all we can do is try to have the kind of maturity and wisdom that would be commensurate with that power. Try to be a little bit more like the Thasians who cleaned up the mess than like Charlie who made the mess. And once you see how really treacherous and how absolutely perilous every kind of power can be, once you see that, then you can not only be grateful and proud of your greatness, but also be grateful and proud for your ungreatness, for your smallness, from those spaces where you are free to just be you and not worry about what's going to happen or not happen because of it. In other words, the freedom to just recognize and embrace how small you are and be glad that you aren't a god, that you are one of us. Well, I hope you enjoyed thinking about Charlie X with me. If you want more videos about where sci-fi and fantasy meet with stuff like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, make sure you hit that subscribe button. But see you in the next one.